In a small, forgotten town surrounded by endless woods and open fields, life appeared quiet, ordinary, the kind of place where strangers rarely passed through and everyone knew one another by name. The streets were lined with aging houses, their paint peeling in the summer sun, and the air often carried the faint smell of earth after rain. But there was one thing everyone shared, though they never dared to speak of it. They all carried a secret, one too heavy to confront. This wasn't a place where gossip died, it thrived. Whispers traveled faster than the wind here. Yet there was one story, one truth, that hung in the air like an unspoken curse. A story that no one dared to repeat out loud. A neighbor whose charm masked unspoken fears. A face that appeared at every church service, every town event, blending seamlessly with the crowd. But the eyes, those who noticed, couldn't quite shake the feeling that they told a different story. And when the disappearances began, one by one, no one asked too many questions. No one raised their voice. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Or was it something far worse? Even now, years later, the silence remains, unbroken. But the memories of what happened here still linger. They say that secrets buried in small towns never stay hidden forever. The question is, why did they stay quiet? And how many lives did that silence cost? To outsiders, the town of Grey Ridge seemed like the kind of place you'd read about in a travel magazine. Picturesque, untouched by time, and perfectly quaint. Nestled between rolling hills and dense, shadowy forests, it was the kind of town where life seemed frozen in a simpler era. The post office still bore a hand-painted sign. The local diner had the same menu it had 50 years ago, and every Sunday the bells of the lone church echoed through the valley, calling everyone together. Grey Ridge wasn't just a town, it was a community. Families had lived here for generations, their names etched into the cemetery stones, and their stories whispered in the halls of the old schoolhouse. Strangers were rare, and everyone claimed to look out for one another. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where children played in the streets until the porch lights came on, and where everyone's business was everyone else's business. But what happens when that familiarity becomes a shield for something unspeakable? What happens when the very fabric of trust that binds a community together is used to keep a deadly secret? For years, Grey Ridge held its breath. Residents spoke in vague terms, carefully tiptoeing around certain topics. There was always an excuse, always a reason to look the other way. He's a good man, they'd say. He's been through a lot. Or perhaps, it's not our place to judge. And then there were the disappearances. They started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A drifter passing through who never made it to the next town. A local girl who left to visit a friend but never arrived. A father who walked out for a pack of cigarettes and was never seen again. There were no alarms raised, no posters hung, no search parties organized. Just murmurs, exchanged behind closed doors and over cups of coffee. Perhaps the most unsettling thing was that no one seemed surprised. Not truly. The people of Grey Ridge knew something was wrong. They felt it in the pit of their stomachs, in the way the air grew heavier with each passing day. And yet, life went on. The church bells rang. The diner served its pie. The children played in the streets. But beneath that veil of normalcy, there was something else, something no one wanted to face. You see, Grey Ridge wasn't the kind of place where monsters lived in the shadows. Here, the monsters were hidden in plain sight. And when the truth finally came to light, it wasn't the killer's actions that shocked the world. It was the silence of everyone who knew. They say every town has its secrets, but in Grey Ridge, those secrets ran deeper than anyone dared to admit. And tonight, we'll uncover the story they tried so hard to forget. Grey Ridge wasn't just a town, it was a place where history seemed to cling to every corner. The weathered bricks of the courthouse, the faded paint on the general store, even the old oak trees lining Main Street. They all seemed to hold memories, whispers of lives lived and stories passed down. But some stories never made it into the open. Some were buried so deeply that even time seemed hesitant to uncover them. The town's heartbeat was its people. Generations had been born and raised here, their roots tangled in the soil like the gnarled roots of the forest trees that surrounded the town. Families like the Millers, the Hargroves, and the Petersons were fixtures in Grey Ridge, their names as familiar as the changing seasons. But among them was another name, one spoken with a mixture of respect, fear, and something else, a name tied to the kind of secrets that lingered in stolen glances and quiet conversations. The name was Stephen Harlow. To anyone passing through, Stephen Harlow seemed like a pillar of the community. He was the kind of man who shook hands with every passerby, who mowed his lawn like clockwork, and who always sat in the third pew on the right side of the church every Sunday morning. He owned the hardware store on Main Street, a business passed down from his father. He offered free repairs for widows, lent tools to young couples building their first homes, and even sponsored the annual Grey Ridge Fall Festival. But those who had lived in Grey Ridge long enough knew that there was something about Stephen Harlow that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just the way he seemed to avoid personal questions, or the way his laughter always felt a little forced. It was the way he carried himself, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, the way his presence seemed to fill a room with an unspoken tension. The whispers about Stephen had been around for as long as anyone could remember. Some said it started when he was a teenager, after the disappearance of a local girl named Emily Caldwell. She was 15, bright-eyed and full of dreams, and she vanished one October evening while walking home from choir practice. Her case was the first of many to remain unsolved, and though no one could prove it, some believed that Stephen Harlow knew more than he ever let on. But Grey Ridge wasn't the kind of town where people asked too many questions. It wasn't the kind of town where people wanted to know the answers. After all, Stephen's father had been a respected man, a war hero who had built the hardware store from nothing. His mother had baked pies for the church bake sale every year until her death. To accuse someone like Stephen Harlow wasn't just unthinkable, it was dangerous. And so, life went on. Emily's disappearance became a ghost story told around campfires. The rumors about Stephen faded into the background noise of everyday life. And when new disappearances began to occur, no one made the connection, at least not out loud. One of the most peculiar things about Grey Ridge was how its people seemed to collectively forget. Or perhaps it wasn't forgetting at all. Perhaps it was something else, a deliberate choice to look away, to pretend that everything was fine. It was easier that way, easier than facing the truth. Take the case of Daniel Rourke, a traveling salesman who vanished after staying at the Grey Ridge Inn. His car was found parked neatly in the lot, his room undisturbed, his suitcase still by the bed. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hargrove, swore she'd seen him leave early that morning, but no one else ever saw him again. The town held its breath for a while, then exhaled and moved on. Then there was Mary Collins, a young mother of two who disappeared on her way to pick up groceries. Her car was found on the edge of the forest, the engine still warm. Her children were left waiting on the porch, their faces pressed to the window as the hours stretched into days. Each disappearance brought the same routine: murmured prayers in the church, lowered voices in the diner, and a palpable unease that hung in the air like smoke. But no one talked about Stephen Harlow, not directly, not in a way that mattered. Why? Was it fear? Fear of what he might do if confronted? Fear of being wrong and tearing apart the fragile threads that held the community together? Or was it something deeper, an unspoken understanding that the town's silence was its only defense against the truth? Whatever the reason, Grey Ridge remained locked in its unspoken agreement. And as the years went on, the disappearances became part of its fabric, like the creaking floorboards in the church, or the howling wind that swept through the valley on cold winter nights. But secrets like these don't stay buried forever, and the people of Grey Ridge would soon learn that the cost of their silence was far greater than they ever imagined. For years, Grey Ridge had learned to live with its unease. The people didn't speak of the disappearances, not openly anyway. They avoided the questions that lingered just below the surface, questions that could unravel the carefully constructed facade of their quiet little town. But one night, something happened that no one could ignore. It was a warm summer evening, the kind that made the whole town feel alive. The annual Grey Ridge Summer Fair was in full swing, with laughter and music echoing across the park. The Ferris wheel's lights sparkled against the darkening sky, and the scent of funnel cakes and roasted corn filled the air. Families gathered to watch the fireworks, their faces lit with joy and anticipation. Among the crowd was a girl named Lila Porter. 17 years old, Lila was the kind of teenager who stood out even in a small town like Grey Ridge. She was bright, full of life, and fiercely independent, a spark of energy that couldn't be contained. She had dreams of leaving Grey Ridge someday, of seeing the world beyond its quiet streets and shadowed woods. That night, she'd gone to the fair with her younger brother Caleb and a group of friends. By all accounts, Lila was having the time of her life. She rode the Ferris wheel twice, won a stuffed bear at the ring toss, and danced to the music spilling from the stage. But at some point in the evening, Lila wandered off. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to slip away from the crowd, seeking a moment of quiet or a chance to meet someone away from prying eyes. No one thought much of it at first. Her friends assumed she'd gone to get a drink or find her brother. Caleb figured she was off with her friends, and when her parents arrived to pick them up, they believed she'd already gone home with someone else. But by the next morning, it was clear that Lila Porter had vanished. Her disappearance sent a ripple of fear through the town. The police were called, and volunteers combed the woods and fields surrounding Grey Ridge. They searched the carnival grounds, the nearby riverbank, and the old abandoned train station. Flyers bearing Lila's photograph were posted on every lamppost, every shop window. But as the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding her alive began to fade. What made Lila's disappearance different wasn't just her age or her prominence in the community. It was the details that came to light in the days that followed. Several witnesses claimed they'd seen her that night talking to someone near the Ferris wheel. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. At first, the descriptions were vague. No one could agree on his hair color or his face. But as the police continued their interviews, the accounts began to align. Stephen Harlow. When his name first surfaced, the town reacted as it always had, with silence. A hush fell over conversations, eyes darted nervously, and though no one said it outright, everyone knew what the whispers meant. The police questioned Stephen. They searched his property, walking through the aisles of his hardware store, rifling through the cluttered garage behind his house. They brought in cadaver dogs, who barked and circled near the edge of his backyard, where the forest crept in like a shadow. But they found nothing. No evidence, no trace of Lila. Stephen, for his part, denied everything. He was calm, composed, even indignant at the suggestion that he could be involved. He reminded the officers of his clean record, his years of service to the community. He pointed out that dozens of people had been at the fair that night, that anyone could have been the last to see Lila. And when the questioning ended, he walked out of the station with his head held high, his reputation bruised but intact. But something had changed in Grey Ridge. For the first time, the silence began to crack. People began to talk, not openly, not loudly, but enough for the rumors to spread. Stories of strange encounters, of moments that had seemed off but hadn't felt significant at the time. A woman recalled how Stephen had once offered her daughter a ride home, unprompted, and how uneasy it had made her feel. A man remembered seeing Stephen walking in the woods late at night, carrying something heavy in a large bag. And then there was Emily Caldwell. Her name resurfaced like a ghost, a reminder of a disappearance that had haunted the town for decades. People began to draw connections, to see patterns where none had seemed to exist before. Stephen Harlow had been a teenager when Emily vanished, they realized. He'd been present at nearly every major disappearance in the years since, but no matter how much the townspeople whispered, no one came forward with proof. The police, bound by the lack of evidence, couldn't make an arrest. And so Grey Ridge settled back into its uneasy rhythm. Lila's disappearance joined the long list of unanswered questions that hung over the town like a storm cloud. Her family left Grey Ridge a year later, unable to bear the weight of their loss. The case went cold, like so many before it. But for those who remained, the fear lingered. The knowledge that Stephen Harlow was still there, still walking the streets, still attending church and mowing his lawn and running his hardware store, still watching. And though they never spoke of it, they all shared the same thought. If he did it once, he could do it again. As time passed, the people of Grey Ridge grew more accustomed to their fear. They began to move through their lives with an almost unnatural ease, as though the town's dark truth had settled into their bones, a weight they could no longer escape. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building, the fear that something worse was yet to come, the unease that, despite the lack of evidence, Stephen Harlow's presence was a warning, one they couldn't ignore any longer. And then, on a quiet evening in late autumn, the storm that had been gathering for years finally broke. It started as a rumor, like so many things do in small towns. Half-truths passed in hushed tones. Someone had seen something. Someone had heard something. But this time, the whispers were different. They carried an urgency that couldn't be ignored. It was a Tuesday night, a night like any other in Grey Ridge. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car that passed by the old gas station or the few pedestrians hurrying to the diner for a warm meal. But as the clock struck midnight, a shrill scream shattered the stillness of the night. It echoed through the streets, chilling the very air as it seemed to reach out to the farthest corners of the town. The scream came from Stephen Harlow's house. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Was it a nightmare? A sound carried by the wind? But when the scream was followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming open and heavy footsteps running down the street, it became clear that something terrible had happened. A neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, was the first to arrive at Stephen's house. She'd heard the commotion and had rushed over, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, her hand trembling. The door was ajar, and when she pushed it open, she found the living room empty, the fireplace still crackling softly in the corner. But there, on the floor, was something far more horrifying, a trail of blood leading down the hall. Mrs. Jenkins froze. It didn't take long for the entire town to respond. Within minutes, the police were at Stephen's door, followed by half the residents of Grey Ridge. They knew something was wrong, too wrong. But it wasn't until they entered the house that they truly understood the gravity of what they were dealing with. The trail of blood led them to the basement. The door was locked, and when they finally forced it open, they were met with a scene so disturbing that even the seasoned officers had to turn their heads. The basement was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something far more fetid. The walls were lined with old tools, rusty and forgotten. But it wasn't the tools that caught their attention. It was what lay in the center of the room. There, chained to a post, was a girl. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn and filthy. She was barely conscious, her face pale and bruised. Her name was Sarah Bennett, a 16-year-old from a neighboring town who had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. The police had written her off as another runaway, another victim of the world outside Grey Ridge. But now they saw the truth. She wasn't a runaway. She was a prisoner. And standing in the shadows, watching from the corner, was Stephen Harlow. When he saw the police, he didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stood there, his face pale and expressionless, as though he had known this moment would come, as though he had been waiting for it all along. The officers arrested him without resistance. There was no need for struggle. Stephen Harlow had already given up. The terror that had haunted Grey Ridge for so long was finally over, or so they thought. But as they dragged him to the squad car, something unexpected happened. A voice, a whisper came from the shadows. It was a soft voice, familiar yet unsettling. "She wasn't the first, you know." The words hung in the air, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. The officers paused. The townspeople stared in disbelief, their eyes wide. Stephen turned slowly to face them. His eyes, once filled with calm assurance, were now hollow, like empty wells. "No," he said, his voice a rasp. "She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last." The words hung in the air like a curse. In the weeks that followed, the town was shaken to its core. Stephen Harlow's arrest brought the revelation of horrors that no one had imagined. The police discovered hidden rooms in his home, rooms filled with photographs, trophies, and unsettling artifacts that chronicled his twisted obsession. The town's history was rewritten. The disappearances that had haunted Grey Ridge for decades, those faces that had been lost to time, were finally accounted for. The truth was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Stephen Harlow hadn't just been hiding a secret. He had been living it. And all the while, the people of Grey Ridge had known, or at least they should have known. When asked why they hadn't spoken out, the townspeople remained silent. Some claimed it was loyalty, others fear. But most simply couldn't admit the truth. They had been complicit in his actions, whether by inaction or by choice. The question that haunted everyone wasn't just why Stephen had done it, it was why no one had ever stopped him. The arrest of Stephen Harlow had, for many, been a long-awaited release. For others, it was the first breath of relief in years, a breath that tasted like ash. The town of Grey Ridge had lived with the darkness for so long, so deeply ingrained in its very fabric, that even in the light of truth, it struggled to move forward. The headlines that followed his arrest flooded local newspapers, and the nation's media quickly caught wind of the grisly tale. A small town, a respected man, and a decades-long trail of terror finally uncovered. Interviews, investigations, and documentaries followed, but they couldn't erase the sense of guilt that hung over Grey Ridge. As the police sifted through Stephen's belongings, they found a deeper layer of horror, an old journal. The pages were stained, tattered from years of neglect, but the writing was still legible. The journal chronicled Stephen's twisted thoughts, his fixation on the quiet, sleepy town he had lived in for so long. He saw himself as both predator and protector, someone who had carefully curated his place in the town, befriending families, becoming a part of their daily lives. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, and as the police read through them, they began to piece together the full extent of his actions. It wasn't just that Stephen had taken these girls, it was the ritualistic nature of his crimes. He didn't simply abduct them. He observed them first, learned their habits, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Each disappearance was meticulously planned, each victim chosen with precision. He had preyed on the trust of the townspeople, becoming invisible in plain sight. But what chilled the police most was the final entry, dated only days before his arrest. It read, "The town deserves to know the truth, but they won't. I'll be gone soon. The next one will be ready. I just have to wait for the right moment." The word sent a cold shiver through the entire town. Was this just the rambling of a madman, or had Stephen been hinting at something more? The question haunted Grey Ridge for weeks. Had they truly seen the end of his reign of terror, or was there something more, something even darker that they had missed? But the investigation didn't stop there. The authorities dug deeper, uncovering a list of names, a catalog of individuals who had been mysteriously linked to Grey Ridge over the years. The disappearances weren't just limited to the girls Stephen had taken. Over the decades, numerous people had vanished, some never reported, others dismissed as runaways or lost causes. The pattern was undeniable. Every few years, someone would go missing. And though the town had always assumed they had simply left, the truth was far more chilling. These were the silent victims, the ones Stephen had watched from afar, waiting for the right time to strike. In the weeks after Stephen's arrest, there was an unsettling shift in the atmosphere of the town. People began to look at their neighbors with suspicion, their smiles now carrying an edge of distrust. The town had always been close-knit, but now it seemed as though every familiar face could be hiding something darker. The memories of long-forgotten encounters resurfaced, casting a shadow over every corner of Grey Ridge. In the midst of this unease, there was one thing that continued to nag at the hearts of the townspeople, the unsettling truth that remained unspoken. Why hadn't anyone ever said anything? Why hadn't they noticed the signs? Why had they allowed the darkness to persist for so long, unnoticed, unchallenged? Many of the town's residents, once close friends, now found themselves at odds. Arguments broke out over what they had known, or should have known. Some pointed fingers, claiming they had suspected something but had never dared to speak up. Others claimed they hadn't seen the signs, hadn't realized the extent of Stephen's deception. The blame seemed to fall on everyone and no one. There were no easy answers, no clear way to absolve themselves. But in the years that followed, the questions only multiplied. Why did the disappearances stop with Stephen's arrest? Why, after decades of unexplained vanishings, did the town suddenly go quiet? Was it that Stephen had been the sole perpetrator, or was there something more at play? Had he been part of a larger, more insidious network, one that had been operating for far longer than anyone could have imagined? And then there was the chilling fact that no one could ignore, the strange happenings that began to occur after Stephen's arrest. At first, it was small things, lights flickering in the dead of night, strange shadows glimpsed from the corner of one's eye. But soon the occurrences grew more frequent, more unsettling. People claimed to hear footsteps outside their windows when no one was there. Others spoke of voices, whispers in the wind, distant and unintelligible, as though someone were standing just beyond the threshold of their homes. It wasn't long before rumors began circulating once again. They spoke of an old house on the edge of town, an abandoned property that had been untouched for years. Some claimed to have seen figures moving through the windows, figures they couldn't quite make out, but knew in their hearts weren't human. Others swore that they had seen familiar faces, faces of people who had vanished long ago, appearing in the streets at night, only to disappear before they could be approached. The fear returned to Grey Ridge. The unease that had once been buried deep within the hearts of its people was rising once again, like a tide that refused to stay hidden. And then came the final, most terrifying question of all. What if Stephen Harlow hadn't been working alone? What if the truth was far more complicated, far more terrifying than anyone had ever thought? But no one knew. No one could say. The mysteries of Grey Ridge, it seemed, would never be fully understood. The town had tried to bury its dark history, but the past refused to stay quiet. And as long as the unanswered questions remained, the fear would continue to haunt them. Stephen Harlow was locked away, the key thrown away. But the story of the small town where everyone knew the killer and stayed silent was far from over. For in the darkness of Grey Ridge, there are always whispers, always shadows, waiting to reveal what the light cannot. You've heard the chilling tale of Grey Ridge, the whispers that still echo through its empty streets, the faces that are forever etched into its dark history. But the question remains, what do you think happened? Was Stephen Harlow the only one hiding a secret? Or was there something more behind his dark reign? We want to hear your thoughts. The mystery of Grey Ridge is far from over, and the shadows seem to be waiting, lurking just beyond what we can see. Do you think there's more to this story than meets the eye? What could explain the strange events that followed Stephen's arrest? Could the town's silence be a clue? Drop your theories and questions in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And who knows? Your insight might just uncover something we missed. And if you enjoyed this eerie journey into the unknown, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more chilling tales, and share this story with someone who isn't afraid of the dark. If you're still craving more, check out our playlist of haunted stories and mysteries from towns just like Grey Ridge, places where the shadows run deep and the truth is never as clear as we'd like it to be. Click the link here and prepare to dive into the unknown once again.